الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. Reading of the Epistle of Yaqub ibn Ishaq al-Kindi. And at times, this epistle is termed the Epistle for Dispelling Sorrows. It's translated here as on the device for dispelling sorrows. This translation that we're using here is the translation of Ghada UC Lane. And he provided an abstract for us that gives us a brief insight into the contents of the epistle or the contents of the small tract. And he says, although less technical philosophically than many of Al-Kindi's known treatises, this epistle remains basic for understanding the spirit that underlies his thinking. Socratic, yet very Kindian in spirit, this epistle displays its author's tendency to harmonize Greek philosophy and Islam, particularly as it relates to ethics and his belief in man's free will and reason. To him, sorrows may be caused either by our own actions or the actions of others. It's a key idea. It is up to us to choose to do or not to do what saddens us. Through reason, we can eliminate some of the causes of sorrow, when we perceive the intellectual world and derive from it things desired. Though this epistle has a significant share of the linguistic and stylistic complexities characteristic of Al-Kindi's writing, it is hoped that the present translation will facilitate its comprehension. Its title in Arabic is Risala Yaqub ibn Ishaq al-Kindi. And the rest of it is not clear because he didn't write it in Arabic. He goes through an overview of the various manuscripts that exist of this text in different places. And I'm not going to go over that because, after all, he actually doesn't go with a lot of depth. And if we wanted to, كنا نريد أن ندقق في الأمر, as we say, if we wanted to be meticulous about the affair, we would demand that he were to give us an introduction to the description of these texts as they exist in Arabic. And he goes on to talk about texts that are in European languages. And he doesn't really give us a lot of insight as to those that exist, other than by saying that Dr. Majid Fakhari had published a text or had published one of the manuscripts of this text, and for whatever reason, it didn't become popular to some thinkers or some researchers in the area. That to me is beneficial, knowing Majid Fakhri's background. And he said that the translation presented here is based on the editions of Ritter and Walzer of Majid Fakhri al-Fikhr al-Akhlaqi al-Arabi al-Falasifa al-Khuluqiyin. I suppose that's where the text is at. In any event, let's move on to what is substantial, because today we're not going to take a lot. We're going to cover the first and second paragraph. Given the concepts that appear, I wanted to make this brief so that we can reflect upon this text and do some self-analyses And when I'm using the word analyses, I'm using it in the plural, meaning to analyze in a number of different ways our state. And in order to do that, we have to allow ourselves the ability to digest what it is that's being said and how it is that it impacts us, or how it is that it can be beneficial to us, or how it is that we can apply it to ourselves, to investigate our state, especially in this age of depression, in this age where people are inclined to sorrow. There's some principles here that help with what we call cognitive therapy, meaning that they help us to analyze the way that we think, even though when we talk about sorrow here, we're talking about the way that we feel. But one of the thrusts or underlying points that we encounter in this text, at least that I have encountered thus far, if I wanted to connect it to Imam al-Balkhi's work, is that there was this reliance in Islamic thought among some of the scholars of the past on giving importance to the intellectual life of the Muslim as a way to take refuge from emotional turmoil. And there's some things to be said about that. But cognitive therapy, one of the premises of it, or one of the points that is based on, is this idea that thinking about our thinking and thinking about our emotions gives us much more control over how it is that we're going to react to the impact or the effects of our thought and emotion. So we wanted to stay within that spirit of reflection and utilize this as an opportunity to not only read this text, but to reflexively read this text, meaning to think about what's being said and also to see how it is that we can take benefit from it. He begins by saying, "May God, O laudable brother, preserve you from every error, guard you from every shortcoming, and grant you success in the paths that lead to his satisfaction and abundant reward." Here, we get an insight into the thinking of Kindi. First of all, the reliance on God for preservation, but also understanding that there is something to be preserved from. More specifically, that is to follow an erroneous path, and the necessity or the need for being guarded. Other other than that, we find that he upfront puts the idea of seeking the pleasure of Allah and seeking reward, abundance, goodness from Allah. The idea that good leads to good, jaza al-ihsan ila al-ihsan, as the Quranic principle brings up. The idea that good opens the path to good, and we're talking about good without limitation here, all kind of good, is an idea that in today's time is lost. And so thinking that there's a path to goodness and that there's a rewarding that comes from God is a basic tenet of faith, is a basic belief that is ignored in today's time. So what happens is that this idea of goodness, it falls to the back, and then we're plagued with 1,000 reasons as to why it is that we uh, are living in a world of evil and negativity and so on and so forth. And so part of Iman, it is to believe in this structure of goodness of how it is that it is embedded in life, and it has its own reward in this world, and it opens up to reward in the hereafter, and that we await from Allah good. That aspect of Iman needs to be recaptured in order for faith to be fortifying, in order for faith to be that which gives us a sense of contentness, given the fact that there's so much trial, tribulation, and ordeal and hardship, and so on and so forth that people experience. He said, I understand your request to be that I clarify those statements that help to overcome sorrows. Before going into this, I wanted to talk about a stylistic point in writing. The authors of the past, one of the things that differentiates them from the authors of the contemporary world is that they wrote with purpose. There was no real pressure to publish and so on and so forth, although they had their own uh, cultural competitions that took place with regard to why it is that people were writing or researching. But the general tendency in Islamic scholarship was to write for a purpose. And usually it was in response to a need in the community or in response to requests that someone made upon the scholar to address a specific issue. And so here, one of the issues that is being addressed is a real issue that's coming from a requester. And that issue is that there be clarification given to the path to overcome sorrows, right? And how it is that it can become clear, right, that the sorrows can debilitate the human being, and how can we protect against their pain and or being dominated by that pain, which can break people. And in today's time, we know that depression has that characteristic. He says, the like of your virtuous soul and of just disposition disdains from acquiring vices and asks for fortification against their pain. And so one of the things that he talks about indirectly here is that there's certain deeds which open up to generating a sorrowful state, and that's the deeds that are classified as vices, right? And so the self here of this particular individual is looking for how to fortify against the pain that is generated from vices, and how to stay safe from being subject to the tyranny of their rule, the rule of vices. So he says, I will describe what I hope will be sufficient for you, and may Allah protect you from all worries. And then he moves forward and says, we have one long paragraph left, and then we come to an end. He says, he mentions a principle to start with, and then he takes a methodological stance with regard to the issue of sorrow. So the principle he mentions with regard to sorrow, he says, for any pain, the causes of which are not known, no remedy exists. For any pain, the causes of that pain, if they're not known, no remedy exists. So in order to be able to move forward to address the issue of pain, we have to be cognizant, aware of, knowledgeable of, familiar with what causes the pain. What causes the pain. And to clarify exactly what constitutes sorrow and its causes, right? So that we can generate remedies that can be employable, usable, available to us so that we can address our state. We thus say sorrow, now he goes into defining what sorrow is a psychological pain. Okay? It's a psychological pain Now, why does it exist? It occurs, right, occurring due to the loss of an object of love. One, loss of something that we love. Two, or as a consequence of not having something that we desire, right? Or the missing of things desired. If the causes of sorrow have become apparent from what has been said to that effect, it is an occurrence due to the loss of something loved or to the missing of something desired. I hope we're clear to that point. We must therefore investigate whether it is possible for anyone to be free of these causes. Right? He mentioned two causes. Can we be free of being sorrowful if we lose something we love? Can we be free of being sorrowful if we miss something that we desire, right? Or we can't obtain to something that we desire. Right? For it is not possible, he says, for anyone to attain all that he desires or to be saved from losing all things loved. The nature of the world embedded in it is this reality of losing and in this reality of not being able to have all of our desire fulfilled. This is because constancy and permanence are non existent. In other words, things don't remain forever in this level of existence that we're in. In the world of generation and corruption in which we live, corruption here means that things come to an end, they die, and so on and so forth. Rather, constancy and permanence exist by necessity only in the world of the intellect. Here, we would say he's talking about in this world, but we also, understand that implied in that is the hereafter, right? Is the hereafter. The perception of which is possible for us. If we do not wish to lose things loved or miss things desired, we ought to perceive the intellectual world and derive our loved things, acquisitions, and desired things from it. So something occurs here. And what occurs here is that we have to be constantly aware of how it is that emotion and desire have an impact on our thinking and have an impact on our state. And so the issue of love and desire, when love and desire are not fulfilled as a whole, in which they can never be fulfilled as a whole because of the nature of this existence, the sorrow sets in. Sorrow sets in as a consequence that, of unfulfilled love and desire, or break in love and desire, or the perception of the absence of love, of that which is loved. And so there's a lot to be said there. But I wanted to pause for a moment. It says, for it is not possible for anyone to attain all that he desires or to be safe from losing all things loved. Right? So it's just a natural aspect of the world that we're not going to be in one state. But the key here is how can we mitigate, how can we work through, how can we navigate, how can we work with ourselves in situations where we find emotional discomfort or where we find displeasure, right? Because of wish fulfillment not being possible, right? This is because constancy and permanence are non existent in the world of generation and corruption in which we live. Rather, constancy and permanence exist by necessity only in the world of the intellect, the perception of which is possible for us. If we do not wish to lose things loved or miss things desired, we ought to perceive the intellectual world and derive our loved things, acquisitions, and desired things from it. That's why, when we talk about Iman, the reality of Jannah, the reality of rooting ourselves in the hereafter, in seeking the pleasure of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, in looking for doing good, and rooting our happiness in that. When we have hope in Allah and we expect from Allah as a priority, which this is not easy, people, but when we do that work and we have an understanding that humans will never fulfill what it is that we need from love 100%. That doesn't mean that we give up on human love, but what it means is that we learn how to put it in its proper place. And when we realize that everything that we desire in the world is not going to come about for us, we need to learn how to tone down expectations and wishes, of unlimited desire. And in that regard, I'm talking more about obtaining things and so on and so forth. And I'm not saying that people should have wishes or hopes for obtaining a material status. But I'm saying that when our happiness is totally bent on that, and when we don't have it, then we're in a bad state. Or when, our happiness is totally bent on our relationships with other people, and those relationships are not rooted properly, and we know that they're up and down, then we're setting ourselves up for emotional failure. We're setting ourselves up for emotional failure. And it's not easy. It's not easy because we as human beings have a need for human relationships. And human relationships without manners, without empathy, without the qualities that make us human, become relationships that are punitive, relationships that bring harm to us, relationships that are problematic. And a lot of times that's why you find there's such an emphasis in Islam placed on character. Character is that which allows us to learn how to treat each other, minimizing harm to each other. But when we think that character is not necessary, then we do things and say things that hurt one another, and then we don't have a means to remedy as well from the angle of seeking forgiveness or apologizing or being humble with each other, being loving, kind, merciful, and so on and so forth. Those things cease to be because everyone pulls into his or her corner, seeking to dominate in his or her position. In other words, to make sure that I'm right and you're wrong, and this situation will not fix itself until you submit yourself to me. That type of approach is an approach which becomes extremely problematic because life it just doesn't operate only on my terms or your terms. That's where in we have to learn how to live with one another. So here, let's move forward. And he says, if we do that, then we are safe from having someone usurp our acquisitions or having some man take possession of them from us or being deprived of what we love of them. Since these intellectual things are not touched by deformity or affected by death, and we will not miss what we seek, since intellectual things sought after logically follow one another, neither moving nor ceasing to be. Thus, they are attainable and not transitory. And so, this is a little more philosophical. It's not that easy to work through. But the idea is that there's certain states, intellectual states, and those intellectual states, in other words, thinking through things uh, and putting thought in its proper place and knowing what's permanent, what's changing, being familiar with what causes what being, thoughtful. It allows us to be more in control over what it is that's going on because emotion is an ocean, it's up and down, and it has its own temperament. But also the intellectuals of the past, they were operating at a higher level in the most simplest way that I can say is that the life of the mind for them, was tied into uh, things that they believe to be more concrete than what we perceive or what we feel. And so for them, reasoning through things, reasoning through things, and especially the dealing with the spiritual world, looking for the pleasure of Allah Ta'ala, in understanding that this world, behind what we see, are principles that are constant, and how those principles teach us higher level truths, and how they teach us about life itself. Like that is what opened up for them the idea of emotional stability. Sometimes it was pushed to an extreme where reason dominated over emotions, because emotions create states in human beings that are not necessarily always pleasurable. Emotion is a mixed bag of pain and pleasure. But the idea that I want to focus on, more simply put, is to orient us to seek pleasure not only in our relationships with one another, but to root ourselves in our relationship with Allah, to root ourselves in expecting and hoping from Allah Ta'ala, and giving people room to grow and develop and know that we fall short, they fall short. That's why mercy, compassion, empathy is important in our relationships with each other, coming to understand with each other, putting ourselves in others' places, being easygoing. That doesn't mean we shouldn't seek justice. That doesn't mean we shouldn't take positions. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have boundaries. But it's important to understand that human beings are frail. And it's important to understand not everyone works on themselves, and not everyone pushes to learn how to deal with other people, so that when they act initially in their interactions, they're acting not only with a good intention, but they're acting being thoughtful and considerate of others. And when they fail people, they're willing uh, to demonstrate humility, and they're willing to demonstrate the intention and the desire to repair whatever harm has been caused. They're willing to learn in the relationship and to follow up harm with that which is good or beneficial. In other words, not to keep the tit for tat going of you hurt me, I'll hurt you, but to look to see how it is that good can be done, so that there's a balance in our interactions with one another. In any event, seeking the pleasure of Allah Ta'ala in learning how to be with the self, right, and attach the heart to Allah Ta'ala, if we can balance that out with refining our character, and we'll find ourselves in a state or in a position in which we can have more balance internally with the self, and we can deal better with the turmoil of life. With that, we end. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.